So like the video said, the pull-out method is free. It's there, in a pinch, but it can be really unreliable. The video did not comment on one of the factors that makes it unreliable, which is that the fluids released by the Cowper's gland can help to sweep sperm that maybe is in the urethra from a previous ejaculation out the urethra and into the vagina when no one even knows that something's happening. And so it may be too late to withdraw. And then really what they were emphasizing that is a really super important part about the pull-out method's failure rate is that it's really difficult to do this method. It's just really hard to do. And so only as a last resort should the pull-out method be used. That's for sure. So what else could we do? Okay, this is still under the category of unreliable methods, and largely because it's a lot of women's menstrual cycles are not that predictable. And so if you do not have a predictable menstrual cycle, the fertility awareness methods are absolutely not going to do anything for you. You have to know when you're expecting your periods in order to know when your fertile days are and things like that. So let's look at some different methods that can be used that involve awareness of the days of fertility. So in the standard days method, you assume that you're on a 28-day cycle and you stop having sex unprotected from day 7 of the menstrual cycle. And as you guys recall, day 1 of the menstrual cycle is the first day of the period. So you count 7 days, whether you're still bleeding or not. On the 7th day, this is the opening window of fertility. And we're going to assume we cannot have unprotected coitus from day 7 through day 17. So we've got 10 days where we're going to assume that ovulation has occurred within that window, and we've avoided having any kind of unprotected coitus during that window. And then we can resume unprotected coitus from day 18 through day 28, when we should then be encountering day 1 of our period. So you can probably already imagine why this technique is difficult to implement, because you've got, days when there's vaginal bleeding. And so for a lot of couples, coitus is something that they don't enjoy doing on days of vaginal bleeding. And then very quickly following that point is the window of fertility. So now we're supposed to avoid sex for 10 more days. And then finally, we have 10 days of coital activity that's unfettered. You can imagine that in couples who have access to each other all the time, they're live-in or they're married or something, they might want to have sex more often than 10 days out of the month, right? And so they may start to have sex during the period, or they might start pushing the window of fertility. And if you have somebody whose menstrual cycle is not exactly 28 days long, you could imagine that this could lead to difficulties very quickly. So some people call the standard days method the rhythm method, because you're supposed to figure out the rhythm of your menstrual cycle. But other people jokingly call it the rhythm method because clearly you've gotten into the correct coital rhythm, because it's a great way to conceive babies, they say. I think the biggest problem with this technique is the just generic no coitus for at least 10 days. And then, for some couples, also the days of menstruation. So it's just really hard to implement. The other thing I'd like to throw in is that sperm can survive in the body for up to 5 days. And so if coitus has occurred 5 days prior to ovulation, there could be still living sperm up in the fallopian tubes waiting for that egg to emerge. And so this, we stop having sex on day 7, theoretically ovulate on day 14. Ideally, there would be no sperm present when ovulation occurs. But if we start pushing that window and we start going, well, maybe 8 days prior to ovulation, maybe we'll do it on day 8. We'll do it on, it's day 10. We start pushing it. And the next thing sperm is still up in the fallopian tube, and ta-da, we've got a pregnancy. So that's why the window is so wide, is to try and prevent that. But in actual use, it can be difficult. How about the 2-day method? Now, this is where women are supposed to examine the secretions emanating from their vagina each day. And they're supposed to look for a particular kind of secretion. In the day leading up to and surrounding ovulation, the vaginal secretions change from, they look different across the month, but during ovulation, they're going to be slippery and sort of the consistency of egg whites. Some women will secrete quite a bit of fluid that's actually kind of viscous, like, uncooked egg whites. Little slippery, kind of might cling to your fingers kind of thing. I'm getting kind of vivid because that's what you have to do if you're going to use this method. You have to look at the secretions and really analyze, does this look like the, slippery kind of egg white consistency that I'm looking for? So if I did see that today, then I would assume I'm probably fertile. If not, then I think to myself, well, did I notice them yesterday? If the secretions were present yesterday, then I'm going to assume probably fertile. If they weren't here today and I didn't see them yesterday, I'm going to say I'm probably not fertile today. This is probably not surrounding ovulation. So it's probably a safe time. So the 2-day method involves trying to determine from secretions, vaginal secretions, whether ovulation is present. So you can imagine that there could be faulty interpretations on this one all the time. But a woman and you can also imagine that a lot of women don't really want to do the detailed work that it would take to figure out whether the secretions are present or not. But if a person tracks these kind of things over time, they might start to see a pattern that would allow them to, really start to predict when ovulation happens and what days to avoid. The basal body temperature method involves taking your temperature first thing in the morning every morning and charting it. And the idea is that over the course of the month, you'll start to see these kinds of fluctuations that are present in the basal body temperature. So in the days, day 1 of the menstrual cycle, remember, is the first day of menstruation. So in the days of menstruation, body temperature is lower all the way up until about 4 days prior to ovulation. There'll be that little spike that you see over the number 10. That's on the 10th day after menstruation. On average, women will experience this little spike of temperature relative to what she had been experiencing. Then it'll go back down again and it'll actually drop below the average temperature that had been being experienced for the previous 2 weeks. That's the indicator that ovulation is nigh. You've had that spike. A couple days later, you get this drop, and that means ovulation is coming. And so then temperature will jump up after ovulation and remain high until the onset of the next period, when it'll start to drop again. So this graphic makes it look like it's a pretty big change, but all this change is occurring within, 1.5 degrees of temperature. So it's not something that you would feel or notice. You would literally have to take your temperature every single morning, first thing when you wake up. If you want to get really super specific, instead of taking it by mouth, you can take it by vagina. And that's supposed to give you a really specific measurement of your basal, which means, your standing or resting body temperature. So you do it every morning, first thing, and you chart it out. And you do this for, several months, and you start to get an idea of what your individual body temperature tells you about ovulation. So it takes a lot of patience. A woman who wants to implement this technique would have to, spend a lot of time using another birth control technique in the meantime, and not a hormonal one. A hormonal one would mess all of this up. You have to be on some kind of non-hormonal birth control method or abstaining from sex while you figure out what the basal body temperature is, and ultimately start to be able to predict ovulation and avoid sex during the time when ovulation occurs. Now, remember, sperm can live in the body up to 5 days. So you wouldn't want to just avoid those 2 days because of ovulation. You'd probably want to avoid the days following that little spike of temperature through ovulation. You probably don't have to avoid after ovulation because you have 24 hours from the time the egg is released until it must be fertilized before it just implodes. So you don't have to drag it out too long after ovulation, but you probably want to avoid sex, unprotected coitus leading up to ovulation, at least 5 days. So that's our little window. I went ahead and followed what, a lot of people advise, which is that broader window past ovulation. But honestly, you can probably pull that in at least a day on the right-hand side. But the more you want to avoid pregnancy, the wider your window. But you'll notice this window is narrower than the standard days window. So we've at least given a few more days of access. And that's really beneficial. Some people, while they're doing this basal body temperature method, will also take ovulation predictor kits just to make sure that the hormone levels, as reported by the ovulation predictor kit, is corresponding to the basal body temperature information, so that they can feel really secure that that's what's going on. You wouldn't want to use ovulation predictor kits every month unless you're trying to become pregnant and having difficulty. If you're trying to avoid pregnancy, that's a pretty expensive kit to be doing every month and trying to avoid around ovulation. If you're trying to avoid sex during ovulation, you want to graph it out and figure out what your actual body's doing. Women who are listening, if you're at all interested in tracking any of these kinds of things, there are apps available for our phones or tablets that are really handy. I know people who really enjoy the, hold on. Wow, I was going to advertise for it. Now I can't think of it. Period tracker, I think it's called. What's nice about the period tracker is it tracks your periods, but you can put other symptoms and other things in there. Like if you want to check the vaginal secretions, or you want to be recording your temperature, and it can actually take all this information and kind of compile it together. And if all you tell it is the first day of each period, if that's all you tell it, it'll start to make predictions based on when your periods have been coming. It'll make predictions about when your next one's going to come, things like that. And then the other thing that's really nice about it is you can actually upload it to your physician, and they can look at your cycles, and that can help with diagnosis of different kinds of menstrually related issues like endometriosis or dysmenorrhea or other things. So it's actually a pretty handy app, and there are other ones available that I thought I'd mention that period tracker. It's free, easy to use. So on each of our methods, I'm going to start telling you, effectiveness and some of the side effects and other kinds of things in a nice little graphic. So you'll have, an easy to look at slide. So the effectiveness of the fertility awareness methods, theoretically, if everything's done correctly, no more than about 9% of women should probably get pregnant if they're, assiduously using this method. In actual use, it's more like a quarter of women become pregnant in a year of using these methods. And a lot of it has to do with, unpredictability of their menstrual cycles, or pushing the windows too. Advantages, one great advantage is it's not, it's a lot of them are free. The different implementations can be free. I put inexpensive because if you do want to, buy a thermometer or buy a ovulator kit or something like that, there's going to be a little bit of cost involved with it. But these methods are very inexpensive and easy to use with regard to that. And then, you can stop doing it anytime you do want to get pregnant. And so it's not like you have a period of time when you have to wait or something like that. There are really no side effects, except for pregnancy, of course, but there's really no side effects to using these. And all the major religions approve of this type of family planning. The disadvantages, well, getting pregnant is definitely a disadvantage of a birth control method, isn't it? So it's got a really high failure rate compared to what we would really usually like. It can be very inconvenient. You've got this lack of spontaneity. We can't have sex for periods of time, or we have to do other kinds of things, or maybe we have to use a different birth control method during the fertile windows, which then means that we're violating, maybe our religious prescriptions against that and things like that. So, there's a balance for sure on the fertility awareness methods. All right. So I've gone through all the unreliable methods, with fertility awareness being, sort of could be reliable if everything was perfect, right? Let's talk about the very vast array of hormonal methods that are available for preventing pregnancy. And I'm going to intersperse this with, videos and stuff to illustrate. Okay, so oral contraceptives, a lot of times we just call this the pill. This is the absolute hands down most popular method in the US for preventing pregnancy. It's also oftentimes used for other health related issues. So it's not, we don't call it the most popular method because so many women are using it at all. We're saying that among people who are using a birth control method, this is the birth control method that is most common. So how does it work? And actually, this is just a really good precursor to how all of these hormonal methods work. They all work by using hormones to stop ovulation. They prevent the release of a monthly egg. They also thin the uterine lining so that if there were a fertilized egg, the uterus would not be very hospitable to it. It's not prepared. It's not preparing itself each month for a possible fertilization. And then it also thickens the cervical mucus. The vaginal secretions that I was mentioning earlier, they get slippery around ovulation because they really serve as a bridge for sperm to be able to sort of get more directly up the cervix and where the sperm need to go, right? With hormonal methods, the cervical mucus thickens up like it normally does during the last part of the menstrual cycle. So this is a response to the presence of progestin, which is a hormone that is secreted in preparation for pregnancy. So you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, why would you take a hormone that gets your body ready for pregnancy if the goal is to avoid pregnancy? Well, what you're trying to tell your body is that it's already pregnant. And so you don't need to ovulate. I'm already pregnant. You don't need to build up the uterine lining. It's already built up because, see, I'm already pregnant. And it thickens the cervical mucus, which is normally something that happens during pregnancy to protect the developing embryo/fetus, right, from any kind of infections and things. So basically the body's responding as if it's pregnant. So I'm going to go ahead and queue up in the playlist Planned Parenthood's explanation of how birth control pills work, and I will see you on the other side.